Yeah.
It's like,
Uh,
fail, everyone, fail you all. All right, it looks like we're live. So, Professor Koons, thanks for coming on and having been willing to have a conversation with me. Would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself before we get started?
no, I'd be happy to. So I'm 63 years old. I've been here at the University of Texas at Austin for 33 years, and did my graduate work at Oxford and at UCLA. And I do originally I did a lot of work in philosophical logic, but more recently it's been mostly metaphysics, especially metaphysics of science and philosophical theology. Those are the areas I work in mostly.
Cool. So, I've been researching Thomism a lot lately. I've had about 3 or 4 different conversations with different Thomists, and I've been trying to understand the different arguments. And so, essentially, my understanding right now is that in Thomism, God is a being whose existence and essence is the same thing. He cannot be a body or composed of matter or composed of parts or have any accidents. He must be perfectly simple, and Aquinas' definition is that God is good itself, perfect, infinite, omnipotent, omniscient, happiness itself, knowledge itself, love itself, omnipresent, immutable, eternal, and he defines all of this as pure actuality. Is that about correct so far?
Yeah, everything there sounds right. Yeah, that's pretty much right.
Okay, so my first question would be, why simplicity? Why does this perfect being have to have perfect simplicity and not be composed of parts? Because it seems perfectly logically possible to have a necessary being who is made of different necessary parts that has a necessary whole.
Yeah, right. So, I mean, you could, and the uh, the Thomistic principle here is that God's not just a necessary being, but He is necessary in itself or in Himself, as opposed to having necessity that derives from something else. Aquinas is actually explicit about that in the third way. Check that out, the second part of the third way. So God is supposed to be the ultimate explainer, right, of everything, and not just the contingent world, but even of the necessary world as well. So even the existence of numbers, sets, pure sets, and so on, are grounded in God's mental activity, so to speak, that flows again from this simple being. So if God were complex, composite in any way, the thought is, and this actually goes back to Plotinus, a Neoplatonic philosopher, a pagan philosopher, who argues in his Aeneads that the absolute first cause has to be simple because it has to be the explanation of the unity of all the composite things. So if God were composite, if the first cause were composite, you could ask, well, what holds the parts together? Why do they unify into a single thing? And that would require a further cause. And so you wouldn't have reached the ultimate cause yet at that point.
Could you give me a more specific examples? Like, for example, if we compare the two, the one Christian idea of a God and a composite idea of a God, or they're just two different things, why would one be take a further example than the other, or why would one take a further explanation than the other one?
Yeah, so I think a lot depends here on whether one thinks these first cause arguments have merit or not. So there are quite a few theists who don't rely much on first cause type arguments. I think Richard Swinburne's sort of an example of this. I mean, his arguments are more uh, inductive arguments based on the need for a kind of mind to explain things. And this tradition that really comes from Plato and Aristotle through Plotinus and gets picked up by the Muslims like Avicenna and Aquinas and contemporary Thomists, uh, thinks that these first cause arguments are terribly important. So again, someone who doesn't value them very much might be happy with a composite God because they're not really worried about whether God is the absolute first cause of everything else, so to speak. But if you are, then the thought is that the existence of God shouldn't leave open any further questions of any further things needing explanation. And if God were composite, so we had three parts, right? You could always ask, and this goes against Plotinus, what holds those three parts together, right? So for instance, in the Christian doctrine of Trinity, you get a variety of views. Some views in which, again, like Swinburne's, where basically these three persons are essentially three different beings that just sort of work together in concert. And the more Thomistic interpretation is, no, there's really just the one being, which in some way relates to itself in a three-personal way. I think the reason again is that Thomas would look at something like Swinburne and say, well, if God's composed of these three beings, what brought them together? What made them coordinated in the way that they are? And of course, Swinburne himself, I guess, would say, well, it's the Father. So even he, in a way, has to eventually find one thing that's the ultimate cause of the unity. And so, looking at Swinburne's view, I would say, well, really, on his picture, it's the Father who's the only real God, right? The Son and Spirit are some kind of, quasi creatures, eternal creatures, or something like that of the one being. That, of course, creates another. This brings up another point, which again, if you think of God as primarily the cause of temporal things, right, then it's not so obvious why he would have to be simple, right? But if you think of God as the cause of all non-God things, whether they're eternal or temporal or not, then I think, again, you're driven towards a more extreme view of what God would have to be like.
Well, could you take the position that the necessary things aren't connected in some way? Like, for example, there's a Platonic ground of math or a Platonic ground of logic, and they aren't interconnected in any way in particular. And so you don't really need to answer that question in the way that they are connected by some external force. They could just be necessary beings in all possible universes in and of themselves.
Yeah. Well, take a particular field like arithmetic or number theory, right? I mean, they do seem to be connected, right? I mean, 2 is the successor of 1, 3 is the successor of 2, and so on. There's a relationship there's some kind of dependency relationship there, right? And it's because of those systematic dependency relations that we're confident that we can affirm universal laws about numbers, like every number has a successor. I mean, if the numbers were all just brute necessities, right, each one existing of itself, then why should we expect them to all obey some common set of laws? So there has to be a kind of ground of that commonality, I think.
All right. I mean, I wouldn't disagree there, but I mean, like, if we take different categories, like take numbers as one category and logic as a different category and change in time as a different category, each category could have its own necessary thing, and none of those necessary things are interconnected in any way. And so those could be separate as categories. And so you could have like 3 different necessary category grounds instead of just one that grounds all of them.
Yeah, that's possible. Though, you mentioned a couple examples like logic and arithmetic, which both seem to be universal in their scope. So, and in fact, they relate to each other. So you can sort of count logical connectives and do the arithmetic of logic. You can do the logic of arithmetic. And so they're not actually completely separate. They actually intertwine with each other in various ways. Now, change and so on, I guess that's a separate issue maybe. But again, really what we're talking about there is the nature of causation in a very general sense. And again, that I think is intertwined with logic and with arithmetic in various ways. So, I think when you really sit back and look at this world of necessary beings, you find it isn't just some sort of random landscape of entities that have no common ground, but rather they form a system of a kind.
What do you mean by intertwined? Could you describe a little bit about that? Because I'm not sure I'm following how you say logic and math and change
Right.
are intertwined.
Well, I mean, so take logic, right? So suppose the law of non-contradiction is some kind of law of propositions or facts in general, right? So if A is P, then it can't be not P at the same time in the same way, right? Well, that obviously applies to arithmetic, right? So if 2 plus 2 is 4, it can't be 5, or it can't be not be 4, right? So logic somehow applies to these arithmetical entities, right? And vice versa. So I could say that in logic we make a distinction between and or. Those are 2 different operations. Well, that's an arithmetical statement we're making, right? We're saying that if you take or and together, you've got 2 rather than 1. So arithmetic applies to logic, and logic applies to arithmetic, right? If logic were just some completely self-contained entity, then it would be mysterious how it could apply to other entities that are distinct from it.
Sure, but the way I see it would be kind of like chairness. Like the chair I'm sitting on, the chair you're sitting on are both chairs, but that doesn't mean they share some kind of ontological quality. It's just a label we've made up to describe something that has a certain function. So it seems like math or logic could be, like in the nominalist sense, just a descriptive thing of reality, which is what I interpret math to be. Math doesn't exist; it's not a Platonic object. It just describes things that do exist, and so it doesn't share a quality with logic. They're just both languages that describe the same things.
Yeah. Okay. So we could talk about this quite a bit. So, in other words, you're suggesting, if I'm understanding you correctly, that logic and arithmetic are sort of conventions of the human mind, something along those lines.
Yeah, just languages, formal languages like English or Latin or Japanese.
Yeah. So, the American philosopher Willard Van Orman Quine, who was an atheist, by the way, I think really destroys that theory pretty convincingly in an essay of his called "Truth by Convention." And the problem is that if you say that logic is conventional, then we have to ask, well, is it a consistent set of conventions or not? Uh, and does it apply to this case or not? And those questions are themselves logical questions, right? So therefore, logic itself cannot be conventional. Logic is the law of all possible conventions, right? Logic is what tells you whether you have a set of conventions that make sense and whether that set of conventions applies to a particular case or not. So yeah, I think that's just a non-starter. Logic can't be a convention. And this actually goes to another question I actually wanted to ask you, because I'd heard that you think that there are no objective moral facts. Is that right?
I'm a moral realist, so I think there are objective moral
You are.
facts.
Okay. Never mind. So I was going to press you on that. Right. So I want to say that in a similar way, there are objective, say, intellectual normative facts. Right. There are objective facts about what it's consistent to think, what follows from what logically, what is reasonable to believe given a certain body of evidence, and so on. And so all of those facts are necessary truths, and they form a coherent system of the kind.
Well, sure. So, but to bring up your Quine argument, it doesn't seem to me to be the case that just because there's a convention that can describe all conventions, that convention is somehow a necessary one. For example, we can say thing. The word thing would be a convention that applies to all possible conventions and all possible things that could ever exist, including a god. That doesn't mean thingness is somehow inherent to all language or all objects. It's just a broad enough description to apply to all different things. Like even Quine doubted the laws of logic, specifically saying that no statement is immune to revision. Revision even of the laws of excluded middle has been proposed as a means to simplify quantum mechanics. So even the laws of logic that we use could be rejected in certain cases, even by Quine's understanding. So I don't see why that would be a problem.
Well, I have to double check, but I don't believe that's true of Quine. I think he was quite dogmatic about classical logic, actually, and you can sort of see why, because he thinks that everything is, as you say, everything else is revisable, but you need logic in order to tell you when you have to revise a system, when there's a conflict that has to be overcome, and so logic has to be a kind of fixed point. Logic is the Archimedean point, so to speak, relative to which you can then evaluate various possible conventions. Right? Do you know the Tonk case? You heard about that one?
Mm-mm.
So suppose logic is completely conventional, and I say, well, here's my logic. I'm going to introduce this new operator called Tonk. Okay, and here are the conventions that govern Tonk. If you have a true statement P, then P Tonk Q is also true. Okay, and if you have two statements, A Tonk B or B Tonk A, either way, then you can infer both A and B from A Tonk B. Right. Okay, so if you had those two conventions, I could then prove anything whatsoever, right? So I could say I'm holding a pen, therefore it follows that I'm holding a pen Tonk 2 plus 2 is 5. But then it follows that 2 plus 2 is 5 from the same rules of Tonk, right? So anybody looking at that would say, okay, Tonk is a really bad rule. You don't want to introduce Tonk into your system so that you can get that easily from I'm holding a pen to 2 plus 2 is 5. But why not? Well, I mean, that's because there's something logically inconsistent about Tonk. Right? It's a set of conventions that violates fundamental laws of logic, and so you need, in order to evaluate any convention whatsoever, you need some kind of a fixed point against which you can say, does this make sense? Will this lead me to absurdities or not? And to lead me to, right? That is itself going to be appealing to something that's not conventional, something that stands outside of the world of conventions entirely.
Right, but then you get examples like paraconsistent logics and quantum logics, like Quine mentioned, because this is a quote specifically from section 4 of Empiricism Without the Dogmas, where he specifically says, the quote I just gave, wherever it was, somewhere in here, that you can doubt even the law of excluded middle, and it's been proposed to doubt it in certain kinds of things. So it
Right.
seems like those conventions, while there are some conventions, they don't seem to hold specifically in the laws of logic sense. You can have paraconsistent logics that do doubt those.
Right. Yeah. I mean, but of course, even the pair-consistent logics would recognize that there's certain core principles that you can't give up. And so, and also, in fact, when people do their pair-consistent logics, even Graham Priest and folks like that, they actually use classical logic in their meta language in order to convince us that it works. So, there are, yeah, there are some things that you could give up. Like law of excluded middle is one that you could probably function without. Um, and you wouldn't. It's not like Tonk, right? It wouldn't get you into deep trouble. But there are other principles of logic, like the law of non-contradiction, modus ponens, things like that, that I think you can't do without. Ultimately, double negation removal, things like that, or double negation addition anyway. I mean, removal you can get rid of, but addition you can't get rid of, and so on. So. Yeah, and I
Well,
mean,
I
look,
would doubt even that. For example, quantum logic, you can say an object exists and does not exist at the same time.
too, though. I'm sorry. Yeah.
Well, even in quantum logic, you can say that an object exists and does not exist at the same time. So you can reject even the law of identity in that case.
Well, I don't think that's quite true. No, I think in quantum logic, what they give up is only the law of distribution. So the law that says if you have the disjunction P or Q and R, then you have the disjunct P and R or Q and R. So it doesn't. No, they don't give up the law of non-contradiction. So quantum logics are not paraconsistent actually.
I saw a few of them where they did include the both, where it's the true and false kind of conjunction in the truth tables. 'Cause I was reading it on the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. Those were the.
I'm not familiar with that. The older quantum logics I'm familiar with, that like Hillary Putnam was playing with, didn't give up the paraconsistent. But yeah, I mean, you could go paraconsistent here, um, right? Um, and I'm not dogmatic about this. I mean, I think there might actually be some weird cases where you get true contradictions involving things like the liar paradox or cases of vagueness, or somebody's both bald and not bald, and things like that.
Russell's paradox.
Well, yeah, stuff like that. Um, but even so, there are core principles of logic, right? Like kind of a minimal logic that even the paraconsistent and the intuitionistic logics and so on would all share, and those at least are not conventional. They have to be treated as absolutes.
Why can't they be conventional? Kind of like the term thing. It's just so broad it applies to everything.
But logic applies to everything in a very specific way, not just again, not in a conventionally determined way, but in a way that we have to respect if we're going to be thinking clearly at all.
But isn't that itself just a convention of how our brains work?
No, I don't think so. I think, I mean, our brains are built in such a way that we're able to think logically, thank goodness, at least sometimes, not always, obviously. But that's a standard that I think is independent of our evolutionary history or of our conventions and so on. So, I mean, again, you're not going to discover a creature in some other galaxy where they succeed and they reason by talk, right? Because it's a bad rule. There's no way you're going to be able to do that. So, so yeah, that's not a convention. It's because it would be a violation of some fundamental law of thought itself. I guess is my way of putting it.
Well, the my objection would be it's not a law of thought; it's a law of nature. Like, for example, I think logic describes nature, and so there is a law in nature that makes it be this way and not be this way. But I don't think it's a law of thought that we're violating here. I think it's just the fact that an object is itself is just like reality is reality, and if it stopped being itself, then reality would not be reality, and that would obviously be a logical contradiction in the way we describe it. But the contradiction doesn't happen in logic; it happens in reality, and which is why since because logic describes reality, that it can't happen in logic additionally. But logic is just a language we have to describe reality.
Well, okay. I mean, I could accept that as long as there are. It's our way of describing constraints that are really out there in the world, so to speak, and necessarily so, right? Not just contingently so, because I don't think you could imagine again, a possible world where Tonk works.
Right, right. I would agree that reality cannot not be reality for sure.
Right, right, exactly. So there are constraints out there, and that hold of necessity, and our logical rules are attempts to capture those constraints. Um, yeah, and so then the question is, how is that possible? Let's say in a purely materialistic world, right? How do you get those sorts of norms, or the moral norms either, for that matter? It looks as though it's a bit of well, it looks like it's sort of a massive mystery, actually, that these normative principles would somehow be located within a world that consisted of nothing but matter and motion. Um, yeah, I mean, you can just say, well, they do, right? So the matter is arranged a certain way, and pop, you get a moral fact, or pop, you get some sort of logical constraint. But I think it's more reasonable to think there's a being who is inherently logical and moral, that is the ground of all these poppings, so to speak, and that sort of unifies them in a way.
Well, for morality, I mean, I would agree there is a moral realism, but in the case of logic, wouldn't the logical truths also apply to God himself?
Yeah, but I think that they do because they are grounded in his nature, his necessary nature.
Could
Um,
you just say the same thing about reality and say instead of it being grounded in God's nature, it's just grounded in nature's nature?
yeah, I mean, you could. I think the question, though, is again one of unification, so to speak. And is it going to be the case that each and every logical necessity is a sort of brute fact, or do all the logical necessities again flow from a single source? And if they do, then it looks as though that source would have to be something like a mind capable of sort of conceiving of all these necessities in some fashion.
Why do you infer to a mind from that? Because, for example, again, because I think logic is describing reality, I think the reality is what's required, and then logic is just something we made up afterwards. So it doesn't, from my worldview, it wouldn't entail a mind. That would be something anthropocentric. We're just imposing on the laws, which are just a feature of reality.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let's think about numbers for a minute, right? So, I mean, the numbers, I think, are in a similar kind of situation, right? We don't create them; they're sort of there already, and our arithmetic is an attempt to describe accurately these numerical relationships. Um, again, this is an idea that goes back to Plato and the others, that numbers aren't themselves material things. They're not really located in space and time, and yet they seem to be real in some sense and mind independent, at least independent of our minds. Um, here's a possibility, right? They arise via the arithmetical thoughts of God. So God is the one who's sort of thinking one, two, three, so on, of necessity. We can sort of understand how that works. And if that's true, then that would provide an explanation for how the numbers could be independent of our minds, and yet still real and still necessary and still constraining reality in some way because they're built into this first cause.
I'm not sure I'm following. Why do numbers need to be independent of minds in that sense? Like, for example, I don't think they are. I think they're just words like tree. Like, there is a tree, and that tree very well describes reality because it's a word we made up to describe reality. And the same way would apply to numbers. Like, if we have two particles, well, we just made up the word two to describe the fact that there's two particles there. It's not like the math is required somehow in the ontology of the two particles.
Yeah, I mean, the very fact that math is so useful in science, though, provides us with some strong reason to think there's something objectively real there. Um, I mean, I know there's the project of Hartree Field and others who tried to blunt that argument and say, it's much along the lines you're suggesting, right? That there aren't any numbers out there, that, it's like an extremely nominalist sort of approach to the numbers. The difficulty I think that Field runs into, well, there's a number of technical difficulties. I mean, the project's kind of run aground in lots of ways because there are parts of physics that really can't be nominalized, it turns out. But in any case, I think the even more fundamental problem that Field has is that he has to rely at a certain point on the notion of consistency. That plays a big role in his account. So although the numbers don't exist really, they're a kind of fiction, but they have to be a consistent fiction. If they were an inconsistent fiction, that would be really bad, and we couldn't use numbers even in science. So they have to be a consistent fiction. So we have to. So the fact that certain theories or conventions or descriptions are consistent, that has to be a mind-independent fact for Field. And it turns out, actually, that thanks to Gödel's work, that logical consistency and number theory are interdependent or intertranslatable, so to speak. So claims about what's logically consistent can be translated into claims in number theory. So if you say that consistency is objectively real, then you really have to say that numbers are objectively real as well, because they are our way of talking about, or they again are logically equivalent to claims about consistency. Right? So in other words, look, consistency itself, and in a way I'm repeating myself, right? Consistency itself can't be a mere matter of convention, right? I can't say 2 + 2 is 4 and 2 + 2 is not 4, and that's consistent because I say so. That's my new convention. I mean, you can't just make things consistent by convention. Consistency is a kind of mind-independent fact about conventions, stories, fictions, descriptions, what have you, right? And so there have to be laws. Let's call them laws of consistency now, if you like, which are these mind-independent laws. And then we can ask, well, what grounds those? What's the basis for those laws? The conjecture here is, well, it's some kind of infinite perfect mind that's the ground of all those laws of logic.
By consistency, it just sounds like a tautology. You're saying the same thing twice, like 2 + 2 = 4 is 2 + 2 = 4. I mean, well, yes, I would agree. I don't see that as a law. I don't see it as a convention either. I just think it's describing reality. So when you say math is consistent, I mean, some maths are. For example, math as a language has sentences that describe reality, sentences that don't describe reality, and sentences that are self-contradictory, just like in English. For example, 1 + 1 = 2 describes reality. F = ma times 37 does not describe reality. And 1 + 1 = 7 is self-contradictory. Just like you can have that's a tree, that's a Klingon from Star Trek, and I'm a married bachelor. Like you can have sentences of all three kinds. So it seems like math is equally as inconsistent as any other language. It's only consistent when we use the kind that describes reality, and we just prefer that particular kind of language as opposed to the other kinds of math that don't.
Okay. Yeah, let me try to explain it a little bit more clearly. So in Field's picture, 2 + 2 = 4 actually does not describe reality, right? That is true only in a fiction that we sort of invented of these numbers, right? But we can ask of any description, right, whether it could represent reality or not, right? And there are some descriptions which, by virtue of their illogicality, cannot possibly describe reality, right? And so Field recognizes at one point that this fiction of numbers had better not be like that. There actually, for Field, it has to be possible that there'd be a world where there really are the numbers, right? So the fiction would accurately describe that world. And if it turned out that there weren't, if it turned out that somehow the story of numbers was illogical in that way, then his whole project falls apart. And you can't explain how numbers could be used in science. So the point here is that, yes, lots of things could be nominalized, lots of things could be made conventional, but the fact that certain conventions are consistent, others are not, that some are logical in this deep sense and others are not, that can't be really conventional, and that can't be sort of nominalized away. There you need some kind of mind-independent fact.
Well, how would you address my version where 2 + 2 = 4 is a fact describing reality as opposed to Field's version?
Yeah. Okay. So let's talk about that. So one could think of that as, in fact, that statement can be translated into a kind of logical statement, right? It can be translated into the statement that if you have two things of one kind and two things of some other kind, then you've got four things altogether, right? So that's actually a theorem of logic, first order logic. So that would sort of take us away from number theory into the world of first order logic. So a better example would be something like every number has a successor, or something along those lines, because that's a statement which isn't a theorem of first order logic. It's actual principle of like piano or some other kind of arithmetic, right? So every number has a successor. Does that describe reality in your picture?
Possibly, yes. I do imagine that the universe is infinite, so it could definitely correspond to reality in that way.
Right. But there might be worlds where there are only finitely many things, possible worlds where there are only finitely many things. And now those worlds that would not describe reality.
Sure. So I would say the same thing would apply to like unicorns. Like we can say there is a horse, and there is a horse with a horn on its head. Like you can take something that does describe reality and then add something else that describes reality, and then make something that doesn't describe reality. So numbers would be the same kind of thing. If you think there's a finite universe and you imagine there is one number that succeeds every other number, you're just taking the parts of that finite universe and combining them in a different way that does not describe the universe.
Yeah. So I mean, a couple consequences to this, right? One would be that arithmetic would only be contingently true, if at all. The basic theory of arithmetic, 2 + 2, well, every number has a successor and so on. These things would only be true in some worlds and not others. And that would be a surprise to our mathematics colleagues, I think. But also, there's some worries here about whether, do we know for sure the world is infinite? Right? Probably not, right? There's still viable models in which it's finite. So in fact, we wouldn't even be sure that arithmetic was true. As Field argues, that's okay. We can still use arithmetic in our scientific work so long as it's consistent, right? And that's where I come back in with my spiel, right? Well, wait a minute. Now you're relying on the mind independence of logic, right, to secure the consistency of the story.
Well, I'm not sure I would agree with Field's version, but for mine, it starts off with just I exist, so I have this. There's sort of this reality. I experience reality around me. That's one. I get the number one from that, and then there's two different things there. I get the number two, and I can start adding them up. And so all of the different variations of the things I can add around me give me the parts of math that definitely do describe reality, or the things that I use to describe reality with. And then I can also combine those in different ways to get things that may or may not describe reality. Like I could go like the principle you said that there's one number after every other, but that's irrelevant to the reality I'm experiencing around me. I can still just use the things I'm experiencing around me to construct a model of math and then build off of that. So everything I'm experiencing is definitely contingent, or the truth of the math is contingent on just these things, and there could be other things that it's not true about. So for example, f equals ma times 37 could be not true, and so that math is contingent and may be true in some universes and not true in other universes. That doesn't seem to be a problem in mine, as long as the model of math I'm building is just dependent on the things I'm experiencing around me, and I only build off of those things. Then it's perfectly fine if that math is contingent on the world I'm describing around me.
Yeah. Okay, good. So what you're actually describing is very similar to a view that John Stuart Mill defended, that mathematics is itself sort of an empirical science. And he's basically was saying, look, you put 2 rocks and you put 2 more rocks together and you got 4 rocks. Oh, 2 + 2 is 4, right? It's kind of an empirical discovery, which means, again, that a lot of my math colleagues here are going about it all the wrong way, right? They should be out in the laboratory, counting rocks and not proving theorems in some abstract system. Gottlob Frege, real important philosopher, mathematician of the late 19th century. I mean, he subjected this Millian view to very severe objections and criticisms, so that you won't find many philosophers of math who will defend it anymore. I'm not sure if I can get back all the objections again, but if you look up his book on the foundations of arithmetic, we could look at that. So let me see if I can summarize that real quickly.
So Foundations of Arithmetic by Frege.
Frege. Yeah. I guess in a way I've sort of expressed the main idea, which is, look, arithmetic is something. It's a sort of a priori science, right? It's something that you can sort of see is true, and true necessarily so, right? Like in other branches of mathematics. But obviously, if you deny that, then and go with this more empiricist picture, that's fine. The problem is, I think, that you're not going to get enough math to do the actual physics that people want to do. So relativity, quantum theory, and so on, those all rely on very sophisticated, powerful mathematical theories that you can go way beyond arithmetic, right? But certainly if arithmetic itself is as incomplete as it would be on your picture, because, I wouldn't even be able to know that every number has a successor. I could just say, well, the numbers I've seen so far, I guess, do, but maybe there's others that don't. I mean, if you had that weak a theory of mathematics, you wouldn't be able to do the kind of stuff that Hawking, Penrose, other physicists do, right? They'd just have to say, well, we've seen stars, I guess. I mean, they wouldn't be able to deduce the kinds of, wouldn't be able to build up these mathematical theories and deduce consequences from them without relying on the truth of mathematics in a more robust way.
Oh, what do you mean? Because in my view, just taking the math that I can see around me, I can combine those in different way, like the horse and the horn to get a unicorn. I can combine different numbers to get imaginary numbers. And even though that symbol doesn't correspond to reality, we can use it to describe reality just fine. Like we can create a book with a unicorn in it. So it seems like we could be able to get all of those.
You're doing Field's approach. That's exactly Field's view. So in other words, yeah, we can construct these fictions, these mathematical fictions. And as long as they're consistent, everything's fine. We can use them in our physics to deduce consequences. If they're consistent, they have what Field calls conservativeness, which means that if you take a bunch of mathematical principles, let's say a bunch of principles of physics, and then you add the mathematical fiction to it, and you derive a bunch of consequences just in the language of physics, you won't get anything that couldn't be deduced in principle from physics itself. So the mathematics won't introduce any new weird physical facts, is his point. But all that is true only if mathematics itself is consistent. And so that's where the logical facts, you hit rock bottom. You hit a bedrock of logical fact that can't itself be conventional or invented.
All right, I totally agree, but I think the consistency is, again, just reality must be reality. I think that it comes from reality itself. Since obviously to be consistent, it has to accurately describe reality, and which is what makes it work. So obviously English would be the same thing. English can effectively describe reality, and you can get many of the principles in physics just by using English if it accurately defined reality and was consistent, if in that meaning of the word consistency. So I agree that it does have to be a consistency, but for me that consistency comes from it accurately describing reality. Is there a correspondence to reality? Are the propositions true? And that would be synonymous in my language of how you use the word consistent.
Yeah, so I mean, I think we're in agreement at that point, right? So in other words, at this point now we're agreeing about the data, that there is this bedrock of logical reality, so to speak, out there. And now the question is, what's the best explanation of that reality? And if it turns out to be this vast field or network of interconnected facts, then that's a lot to take on as a brute fact. I think we would prefer to find some kind of underlying explanation for why it has the kind of form that it does.
So to use an example from the God hypothesis, why would God not also just be a connection of underlying facts? Like, for example, he has all these different perfections, but to me, perfections seem to be like a scapegoat for properties. Just you taking the properties and combining them into a single kind of a property and just calling it a perfection. Couldn't I just do the same thing about the universe? So we have all these different interconnected facts and say, well, each of those interconnected facts is actually just a perfection. And so I could use the same perfection idea to combine all of those brute facts into one perfection fact. It doesn't seem like, why would we assume these perfections is an actual thing? And if it was, why would the particular combination of perfections in a God be the correct combination as opposed to just all the different relations between numbers?
Yeah, well, I mean, you might end up with God by a different name, right? So now you've posited some kind of one being that's the ground of all these different logical necessities. And I'll say, great, okay. And now, of course, we can. I guess there's still the remaining question about whether it's helpful or appropriate to refer to this being in terms of that are mental or personal or whatever, right?
Right. So yeah, I would doubt the goodness thing, the omnipotence or the omniscience, the happiness itself, knowledge itself, love itself. None of those things I think would be required in this pure actuality if there was a pure actuality.
Yeah, right. No, I think that's a fair point. So I do think that where the debate, as I see it going at this point, is that we're seeing a lot more atheists and agnostics who are willing to say, yeah, this thesis that there's a single, simple, ultimate explanation is pretty attractive. It's not a bad idea. And now the question is, well, is that God? Does that have any of the other sort of characteristics that you might associate with the traditional deity? And that's a much harder question. I agree. And I'll have to say that the arguments we can give at this point are pretty hand wavy at that point, right? They're not really rigorous proofs. So I mean, this is a case where again, the worldview that you bring to this is going to make a difference, right? So if I come to this kind of investigation already as a sort of religious person inclined to see God, behind phenomena, and then I come up with this metaphysical theory that says, wow, there's this one being who's got absolute actuality and explains everything. Like, wow, okay, God, right? Whereas if I come to this as an irreligious person with no kind of religious experience and not inclined to believe in God at all, okay, interesting kind of being. No, I don't see any religious implications for that. I think that's a fair description of where this particular line of inquiry is reached at this point. Um, Now, there's some subsidiary arguments that one could start bringing in here. We could talk about fine tuning and that sort of thing as suggestions that this first cause must have some kind of intentionality and knowledge and goodness, perhaps. Um, and there's also the sort of line of work that my friend Tim O'Connor has done in his book on theism and ultimate explanation. So let's suppose we've got this one ultimate cause of everything else, right? How exactly does it work, right? How do you get from that to all the different facts, both necessary and contingent, that have to depend upon it? Um, Especially the contingent facts, right? How do they come about? Do they just sort of spew out of this cause in a kind of random way, or not? If they do, then it looks as though the first cause has to have a kind of quantitatively describable disposition to produce stuff, right? Like a kind of quantum field theory or something that sort of tells you how the thing's going to produce the stuff, and then that's going to reintroduce all kinds of problems about arbitrary parameters, right? Why does this field take these values, not those? So it looks like we're not going to get the ultimate explanation that we wanted. Whereas the theist anyway. Here's the idea: the theist can say, let's suppose that there are some facts about what's good, what's inherently good, and let's suppose that the first cause is an intelligent being and unconstrained by any kind of bias. So now this first cause will just do things because they're good, and that will provide again a kind of non-arbitrary explanation for why we see the world the way it is, as opposed to, again, the competitive, more mechanistic model that's always going to have to reintroduce some kind of arbitrary parameters.
Well, how is that not itself an arbitrary parameter? For example, saying God has this property of goodness, that seems to be equally as much of an arbitrary assertion as just saying the quantum particle has this particular wave function that'll create the universe just as we see it. It seems like we could, if we take all of the possible spectrums of gods and we look at which ones would create a universe like ours, or which ones would create the contingent things like ours, we could say there's a very small amount that would actually create a life-permitting universe, or a universe that has these particular contingent facts, and there's a very small amount of combinations of quantum particles that would create a life-permitting universe, or these particular quantum facts. But if you want to limit that and say, well, I think God could only have this kind of property, this kind of perfection of goodness, and therefore the potential spectrum of gods that would create a life-permitting universe are much higher, I could just say the same thing about the quantum particle. I could say the quantum particle has this particular wave function that would make a life-permitting universe much higher probability under the quantum particle hypothesis. That doesn't seem to be indicative of a god over a non-god. It just seems like you're adding in this, what seems to me to be an ad hoc assertion that God is moral, and so for this moral property would make it more likely, whereas I could just do the same thing on the quantum particle hypothesis.
Yeah, so those are good questions. So my thought is that this isn't comparable because in the first instance, I want to locate goodness not so much in God, but as in possible things to be done. Right? So the thought is that there is just an intrinsic value that all possible things have, and that is a brute fact. And then you've got a being who just responds in a completely unbiased way to the goodness of things that might be done. Maybe there may be an element of randomness to that, but nonetheless, whatever it does, it's going to do because it's good. And so that I think doesn't involve introducing any further parameter. I mean, any being that is intentional or knowledgeable is going to want to do good things, right? And of course, some of us are, because of our finitude, are confused about what's good, ignorant about what's good in some cases, biased against certain goods by various extraneous factors. So the thought is you have a being in which you've taken away all those limitations and all those biases. And so it's a being that simply responds to goodness itself, the goodness of possible acts itself. And that's a satisfying uh, ultimate explanation, is the claim.
How is that different from just saying there is a intrinsic evil and the being wants to do evil in and of itself, and if you don't have any restrictions, you do evil, or that goodness is a emergent property? Like I think, as a moral realist, I think goodness is a higher order emergent property, like fitness or something like that, where it's a property that emerges from the universe and isn't like fundamental in that case. But it doesn't seem like it would necessarily be the case that any intelligent being would necessarily want to do good things. That seems to be an ad hoc assertion there, because I don't see that in human minds that is the case. Given our inductive evidence of how minds work, it doesn't seem to be that we are intrinsically built to do good in all cases. So why would we assume this about a god? It seems just as logically possible to say there's an evil god or a apathetic deistic god. Why prefer this good hypothesis of God?
Yeah, good question. So I guess the thought is that there's a certain kind of underlying logic to intentionality itself. And so if I'm trying to figure out why somebody does something, it always because it has to ultimately bottom out with something like because he or she thought this was a good thing to do for this or that reason. I don't do things because they're bad to do, right? Um, that would be bizarre, right? If tried to if I said, well, he did this because it was a bad thing. No, no, he did it because he thought it was good for this or that reason, right? So the sort of underlying logic of rational action is such that a rational agent is by by the very essence responsive to possible goodness or apparent goodness in some way. And so now the thought is you take away the limitations, the some kind of merely contingent and arbitrary limitations of ignorance, bias, and so on. You end up with a being that will just respond to goodness directly and immediately.
Yeah, from my perspective, the goodness or badness is kind of like the chair. It's just something that it's a vague enough description that we apply to anything we want to do. For example, Hitler may have thought it was good to eradicate the Jews or whatever, but that wasn't some kind of reference to objective goodness. It's just something that he thought. He personally approved of this, and so he labeled it as good. It
Right.
wasn't that there was an objective goodness there, and he was in search of it and was just misunderstanding the goodness. He just wanted to do this, and he labeled it as good. So it seems like the fact that we do things and label them good isn't indicative that all humans are tending towards some goodness thing. It just seems like we like to use that label for anything we want to do.
Yeah, but I mean, even if you take somebody really diabolically evil like Hitler, you'll find that he does rationalize what he's doing in terms of supposed goods that are going to result, right? So, the Jews are deserving of punishment because of the various things they've done, and deserved punishment is a good thing. So let's deliver it, right? So yeah, I mean, he did in the end act in response to apparent goods, and he was wrong, or deeply wrong about what's good. So for human beings, there's often a gap between what we take to be good and what's really good in that situation, right? But nonetheless, we're always acting for the apparent good. And again, the thought is that God is a being for whom there are no limitations, and so therefore there's never the apparent good just is the good, right? There's no gap there, and that again gives you this elegantly simple explanation.
Well, sure, but my question there was, why would you think that that would be the case? Because God could just say, I'm going to create chocolate ice cream right now because I want chocolate ice cream or whatever. And I think that's good because I like chocolate ice cream. Or I'm going to create a universe and flood all its occupants because I didn't like what they did or something. And that's the perfect good. So it seems like this definition of perfect good in the context of a God would be just like the context of a human of, I want to do this, therefore it's good because I want to do it.
Well, but I don't think we think that way at all, right? I don't do things simply because I want to do them. I want to do them because I think they're good things to do. Um,
In
so
my understanding of in psychology, it's usually the opposite of the case. Usually we want to do them and then we post hoc label that as good and find justifications for it to fit our personal biases, which are usually have nothing to do with our cognitive decisions, but usually have to do with underlying biology.
yeah, yeah. I mean that. has such a pessimistic view of human nature. I think it would ultimately be self-defeating. I mean, it would mean that when the psychologists come up with their theories and embrace these theories, they're not doing it because they think they're true. They just want to believe these things, and then they rationalize their wants by an ad hoc kind of way. So now science isn't really possible, right? Science is just people believing things because they want to, never because they actually think this is the right thing to believe because it's true, right? Whereas I want to say, no, no. I mean, for the most part, scientists believe things because they think it's good to believe them because they think they're probably true, right? And so they're responding to perceived goods rather than just taking desires and projecting them onto the world in some way. Um, yeah, my colleague Jonathan Dancy's written quite a bit about this actually. So there's a kind of standard view which I think you're reflecting of sort of David Hume kind of picture where you just got a bunch of sort of random desires, right? And then you have beliefs about how to satisfy those desires, and that's sort of how that explains our behavior. And we don't have to bring reasons or goodness into the picture at all, right? And I think that doesn't make sense, right? So for instance, and this is I think one of the points that Dancy makes. I mean, Hume sort of assumes that if I have a desire, other things being equal, it's sort of good to satisfy that desire, right? Which I think is probably right, right? So if I'm really, really thirsty, other things being equal, satisfying that thirst seems like a good thing, so I'm going to drink. And if you take that away, you say, wait a minute, no, who knows whether satisfying a desire is good or not? Now suddenly the Humean picture doesn't really make any sense. Why am I going around satisfying the desires? What's the point of that? I might do the opposite, right? And now the whole notion of rational agency just kind of crashes and burns at that point. So I think to make sense, if we're really going to take rational agency seriously, and we better do that if we're going to have science as a possibility, then you have to take seriously the idea that people do things for reasons, and the reasons are a recognition of the goodness of the act that you're doing, the value of what you're doing, in some sense.
Well, what would be the problem with taking like Dan Dennis' epiphenomenal view of consciousness, and because science seems to be perfectly consistent with that, it just doesn't seem to have certainty.
Yeah. Well, okay. So there's a lot of problems with Dennis' view, I think. I mean, for one thing, Dennett's view undermines the very kind of evolutionary explanations that he wants to offer in other places. So for instance, if Dennett's right, then the patterns that we see in biology are also merely kind of epiphenomena, right? What's really going on in particles and vacuums and things like that. And all this talk about reproduction is just a kind of, for all practical purposes, useful approximation or sort of real pattern, as he puts it, right? But then that means that you can't take those kind of explanations as foundational in your philosophy, which is exactly what he then does, right?
What do
So,
you mean by foundational in that context?
well, so let's put it this way: if I ask Dennett, well, what makes one of these patterns a real pattern? Why is a pattern that we get in evolutionary biology, let's say, better than a pattern that we just sort of take the Wizard of Oz or Lord of the Rings or something like that and just sort of map it onto physical reality in some arbitrary way? What makes one a real pattern and the other not? And his answer is, well, because it's an observer relative thing. We observers can use these real patterns to control things and manipulate our environment and so on, right? But then if you ask, well, wait a minute, how do observers fit into your story of the world again? It turns out they're just part of these real patterns. They're not sort of outside the real patterns, kind of with reference to which you can discern which patterns are real and which ones aren't. They're actually just part of the patterns themselves. And so, you've got Frodo as an observer in my Lord of the Rings story, which I map arbitrarily onto the physical world. And so it turns out that Lord of the Rings is just as real as Darwinian biology, right? They're both just epiphenomena of some underlying physical reality. And that, I think, is that at that point you reduced it to a kind of absurdity.
Well, I mean, if Frodo was a conscious being and could definitely experience that, I would totally agree. I think it would be, but I think in that sense, it is contingent on the observer because you have to have a quality experience to experience it.
Exactly. So now you've introduced dualism, right? Now you've made consciousness as more fundamental, really, right? Because you have to use consciousness in order to discern which of these epiphenomenal patterns are real and which ones aren't, which ones are bogus.
Well, I wouldn't say that's dualism. I'd say that's just epistemic dualism in the fact that, well, we start with our conscious experience, but it doesn't tell us what our conscious experience is therefore made of. It could still be purely material or idealistic in some sense. So starting with our experience seems perfectly reasonable without going straight to dualism.
Frodo can do that too, right? I
Sure.
mean, he can do dualism. And we want to say in the end of the day, I'm real and Frodo isn't, right? But and to do that, you're going to have to go outside of the parameters within its picture. You're going to have to say, well, there's like real consciousness that corresponds to me and you, and not to Frodo.
Well, sure, but it can still be real and epiphenomenal in the fact that it doesn't cause anything. So, for example, our conscious experiences can be a result of our brain states, and then we think we do things, but we don't. It's really just like the fMRI studies on being able to tell what someone's going to choose before they actually choose it.
Yeah, but again, this notion of real and its real patterns is relative to an observer, right? And so, you can't then include the observer in the thing that is supposed to be real relative to the observer. You get into a vicious circularity or kind of infinite regress at that point.
I'm not sure I'm following. So, for example, when I think of real patterns, like I think of there's a larger clump of matter there than clump of matter there. And so that's something that's not contingent on the observer. The only thing that's contingent on the observer is how we label those things.
Yeah. So, I mean, like we see these various clumps of matter and we label them as organisms reproducing themselves and genes and all that kind of talk, right? And so that's a certain story which you can map onto reality. But I mean, I've used this in a couple of my papers. There's some work by Hilary Putnam, and it actually goes back to Gödel, that you can take any consistent story whatsoever, like Lord of the Rings, or if it's not consistent, fix it up a little bit, and then you can project that onto the same physical reality, right? You can come up with an interpretation function relative to which this matter is Frodo climbing up Mount Doom, and so on. And there are observers within that story too, like Frodo, right, and Gandalf and whatnot. Just like there are observers, like you and I, who are part of this other story, this story that is connected with Darwinian evolution and so on. And so we want to say, I want to say anyway, that the second story is true in a way that the first story is not, right? And that requires something else beyond what the resources Dennett gives us. Either we have to say there are fundamental realities that are not merely physical, or you have to go kind of dualist and say, well, there's real acts of consciousness, which you and I have and Frodo and Gandalf don't have, and that's what explains the difference.
I'm not sure I'm seeing a difference there, because from my perspective, I'd say that if you're just doing it in a kind of an analogical sense and saying that ant is Frodo or something, and maybe it perceives the world to be like Lord of the Rings or something, then I would say, sure, that could be true from the ant's perspective. But I still think there's an objective fact of the matter of that there's that reality independent of our consciousnesses. And what makes one more true or less true is if the propositions described in our perception more or less correspond to that reality.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you think this through, you're going to see that you'll end up with a kind of, again, a kind of skeptical conclusion, because, I mean, obviously, when Frodo and Gandalf try to work out the theory of the world from within their pattern, their fiction, they're not going to get quantum mechanics, right? And the vast majority of patterns out there are not going to get the theories that we get. And so I'd have really good grounds to doubt that our theories are the ones that correspond to reality. And so now I've lost that foundation altogether. I've lost my grip on the physical reality.
Oh, sure, kind of like Plantinga's evolutionary argument is naturalism. But I'd say fallibilistically, yes, you're right. We don't have certainty, but I think that given our understanding of reality, we do have a good evidential basis to conclude those things, even if we would have a different evidential basis and a different conscious dependent worldview.
Yeah, no, I think it's worse than that. I think it's actually a case where you have a good grounds for being pretty certain that we're wrong, right? Because the vast majority of patterns are wrong, and if we're just an arbitrary pattern, then there'd be no reason to think we were right.
Well, yeah. Before you go, I had one last question, which was about the simplicity thing.
Sorry, but I'm coming up on an hour. I'm coming out on a kind of a hard break I have to make here soon. So
yeah, absolutely.
Appreciate it. I appreciate the chance to chat about this. Maybe we could have a follow up at some point.
Definitely. I'll contact you again. I'll enjoy your teaching day.
All right, great. Thanks very much.